Some secrets aren't meant to stay buried forever. Sometimes they find their way back to us when we least expect them. 62-year-old Mabel Crowe lives alone in the Pine Ridge Mountains with her bees and her old pig, Hank. Her days are quiet and simple. But one spring morning, Hank starts digging near an old fire pit and won't stop. 3 days he digs in the same spot. When Mabel finally goes to see what he's found, she pulls out a rusted metal tin wrapped in ivy. Inside is an old photograph and a letter to someone who vanished years ago. What has been hidden on her land all this time? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air in Pine Ridge carried the scent of pine needles and wild honeysuckle, the kind of crisp mountain freshness that made Mabel Crowe grateful she'd chosen this life. She stood on her cabin porch, bare feet against worn wood, watching the sun climb over the eastern ridge. The light came slow here, filtered through layers of ancient trees that blanketed the mountain in every direction. Her small property sat in a natural hollow, protected from the worst winds, blessed with a spring that never ran dry. Mabel had lived here for 30 years, the last 5 of them alone. The cabin was modest but sturdy, built from local timber back in the 1940s and renovated piece by piece when she and Roy bought the place in 1995. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a sitting room with windows that face the orchard. Roy had replaced those windows himself, insisting on the best view for his wife. She could still see his careful measurements penciled on the doorframe. Never had the heart to paint over them. The orchard sprawled behind the cabin. 20 apple trees and a dozen pear, all semi-wild now but still producing. Beyond that, her beehives stood in neat rows, 8 white boxes that hummed with life from spring through fall. Beekeeping had been Roy's passion first. He'd learned it from his grandfather and taught Mabel with the same patient hands that had built furniture, fixed engines, and held her close on cold nights. When his heart gave out 5 years ago, sudden and merciless at 63, Mabel considered selling everything. The silence had been unbearable at first, but the bees needed tending, and she'd made Roy a promise. So she stayed. She learned to manage the hives alone, to harvest honey and render wax, to speak softly to the colonies the way Roy had. The work became meditation, the routine became comfort. Over time, the silence transformed from enemy to companion. Her only other companion was Hank, the old boar pig who'd wandered onto the property 3 years back, half-starved and suspicious. Mabel never discovered where he came from. She'd asked around Pine Ridge, posted notices at Vernon's store, but no one claimed him. So she built him a shelter near the barn, fed him scraps and grain, and he stayed. Hank was massive, 300 pounds of bristled grey muscle, with intelligent eyes that followed her everywhere. He wasn't a pet, exactly, more like a neighbour who'd decided her land suited him fine. Pine Ridge wasn't much of a town, just a collection of homes and farms scattered across the mountain valleys, with a general store. A church and a post office clustered at the crossroads. The nearest proper town, Millbrook, sat 45 minutes down winding roads that turned treacherous in winter. Most folks who lived up here preferred it that way. Privacy mattered. So did self-reliance. You learned to fix your own problems, grow your own food, and trust your own judgment. Mabel's closest neighbor was Trudy Walsh, a retired nurse who lived 2 miles down the mountain in a tidy house with solar panels and a satellite dish. Trudy had moved up from Charlotte 15 years ago, seeking quiet after 3 decades in hospital emergency rooms. She was practical, sharp-witted, and had become the closest thing to family Mabel had left. They met for coffee twice a week, traded books and garden vegetables, and helped each other with tasks that required 2 sets of hands. Vernon Kemp ran the general store at the crossroads, a place that smelled of coffee, old wood, and kerosene. Vernon was 68, born and raised in Pine Ridge, keeper of local history and gossip both. He knew every family's business, going back generations, knew which properties had good wells and which had bad reputations. His father had been deputy sheriff back in the 1960s, and Vernon had inherited both the family store and a certain authority in community matters. People trusted his judgment, valued his discretion. Pastor Lee Brenner presided over Pine Ridge Community Church, a white-clapboard building that seated maybe 50 people on a good Sunday. She was younger than most of her congregation, only 47, and had come to the mountain from seminary with idealistic notions about rural ministry. 15 years later, she'd lost the idealism, but gained something better: genuine love for her flock and deep respect for mountain ways. She knew when to offer counsel and when to offer silence, when to pray and when to simply sit beside someone in their grief. These were Mabel's people now. Not quite friends, not quite family, but the essential connections that made solitary mountain life bearable. They checked on each other, showed up when needed, and respected boundaries the rest of the time. The morning Hank started his obsessive digging had begun like any other. Mabel woke at dawn, made coffee in the old percolator Roy had insisted on keeping, and carried her cup out to the porch. The May air was perfect, cool enough for a sweater, but promising warmth. She'd planned to check the hives that morning, then work in the garden. Simple, predictable, peaceful. But when she walked out toward the orchard, she noticed Hank behaving strangely. Instead of his usual routine, rooting through the compost pile, checking under the pear trees for fallen fruit, he was focused on a specific spot near the old fire pit. The fire pit sat about 50 yards from the cabin, a circle of stones Roy had arranged for autumn evening fires. They hadn't used it much in recent years. Weeds and moss had taken over, and wild grapevines wrapped around the stones. Hank was digging there, snout deep in the earth, throwing dirt behind him with single-minded determination. Mabel called to him, but he ignored her completely. That alone was unusual. Hank typically came when called, especially if food might be involved. She walked closer, watched him work. His behavior seemed almost frantic, driven by something she couldn't understand. "What have you got there, old man?" she asked, kneeling beside the pit. The ground was disturbed, torn up in a rough circle about 3 feet across. Whatever had caught Hank's attention, it was buried deeper than tree roots or field mice. She tried to pull him away, but 300 pounds of determined pig couldn't be moved. Finally, she left him to it, figuring he'd lose interest eventually. But the next morning he was at it again, and the morning after that. 3 days of relentless digging, always in the same spot, always with that strange intensity. On the third evening, Mabel stood watching him as the sun set behind the western ridge, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Something about Hank's behavior unsettled her. Animals had instincts humans had lost, could sense things buried beneath the surface. Roy used to say pigs were smarter than dogs, could find anything worth finding. But what could be there that mattered so much? She thought about the property's history, the fragments she'd gathered over the years. When they'd bought the place, the real estate agent mentioned it had been abandoned for decades, sold cheap by the county after sitting vacant since the early 1970s. The cabin had needed extensive work, the land had gone wild, but Roy saw potential. He'd loved the isolation, the challenge of restoration. They'd never asked many questions about previous owners. It seemed unimportant then. Now, watching Hank dig, Mabel wondered. Old-timers in Pine Ridge occasionally mentioned things about various properties, warnings about bad luck or troubled ground. She'd dismiss such talk as superstition. But mountain people didn't speak of troubled ground without reason. They remembered things, held on to stories longer than outsiders expected. That night, sleep came slowly. Mabel lay in bed listening to the mountain sounds, wind through pines, an owl calling, the distant yip of coyotes. Her mind kept returning to Hank and that spot by the fire pit. Tomorrow, she decided, she'd take a closer look herself. If something was buried there, she wanted to know what. This was her land, her home, her responsibility. She'd face whatever secrets it held. In the darkness of her bedroom, surrounded by Roy's books still on the shelves and his reading glasses still on the nightstand, Mabel made a choice. Some might call it curiosity, others might call it foolishness. But she'd lived 62 years on this earth, buried a husband, survived grief that should have broken her, and learned to thrive in solitude. Whatever Hank had found, she could handle it. She'd excavate carefully, respectfully, and deal with the truth, whatever it turned out to be. The mountain held its secrets close, but morning would come, and Mabel Crowe would start digging. Dawn brought clarity and resolve. Mabel, dressed in work clothes, made a quick breakfast of toast and eggs, then gathered tools, a garden spade, a hand trowel, work gloves. She walked out to the fire pit where Hank was already stationed, snuffling at the disturbed earth. The morning light revealed just how much digging he'd done. The hole was nearly 2 feet deep now, the surrounding ground littered with loose dirt and torn roots. "All right, Hank," she said quietly, kneeling beside him. "Let's see what you've been after." She began removing earth carefully, layer by layer. The soil here was darker than elsewhere on her property, rich with decomposed organic matter. About 18 inches down, her trowel struck something solid. Not stone, the sound was wrong for that. Metal, maybe, or very dense wood. She brushed away more dirt, revealing a corner of rusted metal, wrapped in what might once have been canvas or burlap, now rotted to dark fragments. Her heart rate quickened. This wasn't natural. Someone had buried this deliberately, had taken time to wrap it, to place it here. She worked more carefully now, exposing the edges. It was a tin box, roughly the size of a large book, sealed shut with rust and time. The metal surface showed remnants of paint, maybe dark green originally, now flaked down to bare metal spotted with corrosion. Mabel sat back on her heels, studying the find. Should she open it here or take it inside? The historian in her said document everything, photograph it, treat it as evidence of something. But evidence of what? She compromised, taking several photos with her phone before carefully extracting the tin from its earthen tomb. It was heavier than expected, dense with whatever contents had survived decades underground. Hank watched as she carried it back to the cabin, his work apparently complete. He followed her to the porch, then settled into the shade with a satisfied grunt. Inside, Mabel cleared her kitchen table and set the tin down carefully. She made fresh coffee, needing the ritual to steady her nerves. Something about this felt significant, though she couldn't explain why. She studied the tin in better light. The seal looked complete, no obvious gaps where water might have entered. That was good. Whatever was inside might have survived intact. Using a butter knife as a lever, she worked at the lid. Rust resisted at first, then gave way with a groan of corroded metal. The lid came free, releasing a smell of old paper, damp earth, and time. Inside, wrapped in plastic bags that had somehow stayed mostly intact, were 2 items, a photograph and a folded letter. Mabel carefully removed the photograph first. Black and white, printed on heavy stock, showing a young woman standing on a porch. Her porch, she realized with a start. The cabin in the background was unmistakable, though the porch railing looked different, newer. The woman appeared to be in her early 20s, wearing a simple dress in a style Mabel associated with the 1960s. She was smiling at the camera, one hand resting on her pregnant belly, the other shading her eyes from the sun. Beautiful in an unassuming way, with dark hair pulled back and an open, trusting expression. At the edge of the photograph, barely visible, was the shadow of whoever held the camera, a man's silhouette. Tall and broad-shouldered, Mabel set the photo down gently and reached for the letter. The paper was yellowed, fragile, water-stained at the edges but mostly legible. Written in careful cursive, the ink faded to brown. The letter began, "My dearest L." She read slowly, piecing together words where water damage had blurred them. "My dearest L, I can't stay much longer. You must understand that. They'll never accept what we've done, never forgive what we are to each other. The world we want doesn't exist yet, perhaps never will. But I refuse to regret loving you. Meet me at the old place Thursday evening. I'll have everything arranged. We can start over somewhere they'll never find us. Bring only what you can carry. Leave everything else behind. The past doesn't matter anymore, only our future. Forever, Jay." The date at the top of the letter read June 1968, nearly 60 years ago. Mabel read it 3 more times, her mind racing. The phrasing suggested secrecy, urgency, forbidden love. The pregnant woman in the photograph, was she Elle? Was this her letter? But why bury it here? And who were these people? She examined the photograph again more closely. The woman wore a wedding ring, visible in the image. So not unwed and hiding pregnancy, but something else. Running away from an existing marriage, perhaps. Or the man writing the letter was married to someone else. The pieces didn't fit together yet, but Mabel felt the weight of old tragedy. The tone of the letter, desperate hope mixed with fear, suggested these people never got their fresh start. Something had gone wrong. Something significant enough that this tin ended up buried by her fire pit, its contents preserved like a time capsule of broken dreams. She needed more information. The photograph and letter were clues. But to what? A love affair? A disappearance? She thought about taking them to Trudy, getting her friend's perspective. But first, Vernon, if anyone would know the property's history, the families who'd lived here, it was Vernon Kemp. Mabel carefully placed both items back in the tin, photographed everything again for her records, then wrapped the tin in a kitchen towel. She'd drive down to the store this afternoon, but first she returned to the fire pit. Hank had lost interest, wandering off toward the orchard, but Mabel knelt at the excavation site again. She examined the hole more carefully now, looking for anything else that might have been buried. The soil was disturbed deeper than where she'd found the tin, as if something larger might be beneath it. Using her spade, she dug a bit further, widening the hole. About 6 inches deeper, her tool struck something solid again. Not metal this time, but stone. She cleared away dirt and found what looked like the corner of a foundation stone, old mortared brick. That was odd. The fire pit sat well away from any structure. Why would there be foundation work here? She excavated more carefully around the stone, following its edge. It connected to another stone and another. They formed a rough rectangle, perhaps 6 feet by 8 feet, mostly buried. A small building had stood here once, she realized. A shed, maybe, or a root cellar. And someone had built the fire pit directly over where it had been. Why? What were they trying to hide or mark or forget? Mabel sat back, brushing dirt from her gloves. The morning sun climbed higher, warming her shoulders, but she felt cold inside. This wasn't just buried treasure or forgotten belongings. This was something darker. The letter, the photograph, the hidden foundation, all pieces of a story that had been deliberately covered up. She thought about the woman in the photograph. That trusting smile, that protective hand on her pregnant belly. Where was she now? Had she escaped with her mysterious Jay? Or had something prevented that Thursday evening meeting that planned fresh start? Mabel looked out across her property. This place she'd called home for 30 years, where she'd been happy with Roy, where she'd grieved him and learned to live alone. The land suddenly felt different, heavy with questions and old sorrows. Her sanctuary had been someone else's tragedy. She needed answers. Not just for curiosity's sake, but because whoever that woman was, whatever had happened to her, deserved to be remembered, deserved to have her story told. Mabel gathered her tools and headed back to the cabin. She'd clean up, make herself presentable, and drive down to Vernon's store. The past had just reached up from the ground and demanded attention, and Mabel Crowe wasn't the kind of woman to ignore such a call. Vernon's general store sat at the crossroads like it had for 80 years, a 2-story building with a covered porch and faded Coca-Cola signs. The parking area held 3 trucks, which meant a moderate crowd inside. Mabel carried the wrapped tin under her arm, feeling its weight like a responsibility she hadn't asked for, but couldn't ignore. Inside, the store smelled of coffee and wood smoke. Vernon stood behind the counter, ringing up purchases for old Howard Mills. 2 other men sat by the pot-bellied stove, though the day was too warm for a fire. They nodded at Mabel as she entered. She nodded back, waiting patiently while Vernon finished with his customer. When the store finally emptied, Vernon looked at her with the sharp attention he reserved for matters of importance. He was a lean man, weathered by mountain life, with eyes that missed nothing. "Mabel," he said, his voice neutral but curious. "Don't usually see you down here midweek." "Need to ask you something about the property," she said, setting the wrapped tin on the counter. "About who lived there before me and Roy." Vernon's expression shifted subtly, a tightening around his eyes. "That's going back a ways. 1960s, I think." She unwrapped the tin carefully, opened it, and showed him the photograph and letter. "Hank dug these up near the old fire pit. Someone buried them deliberately." Vernon lifted the photograph, studied it in the light from the front window. His face went still, the way faces do when memory surfaces unexpectedly. He set the photo down, glanced at the letter but didn't pick it up. "Where exactly did you find this?" he asked quietly. "Buried about 18 inches down, wrapped tight. There are foundation stones underneath too, like a small building used to stand there." Vernon moved to the store's front door, flipped the sign to "back in 15 minutes", and locked it. He gestured for Mabel to follow him to the back room, his office, where he could speak privately. They sat at a cluttered desk, surrounded by inventory boxes and old ledgers. "The Pritchards," Vernon said finally. "James and Lorraine Pritchard. They owned your place from 1965 to 1968. Mabel felt something settle into place, a name attached to the young woman's face. "What happened to them?" Vernon pulled off his glasses, cleaned them with his shirt, a delaying tactic. "Lorraine disappeared in June 1968, just vanished. James claimed she ran off, said she'd been unhappy, wanted to leave the mountain. My father, he was deputy sheriff then, didn't believe him. Searched that whole property top to bottom, brought in dogs, everything. Never found a trace of her. And James left town a few months later. Investigation went cold. Nothing to charge him with, no body, no evidence. Just a missing woman and a husband with a story nobody quite believed." Vernon put his glasses back on, met Mabel's eyes. "My father worked that case the rest of his life in a way. Never could let it go. Died 10 years back, still wondering what happened to Lorraine Pritchard." Mabel's hands were steady as she pointed to the letter. "This is signed J. Could be James writing to Lorraine, or someone else writing to her." "Could be either," Vernon agreed. "But why bury a letter and photograph? Why hide them?" "Maybe evidence of something," Mabel said. "Something someone didn't want found." They sat in silence for a moment, the implications hanging heavy between them. Finally, Vernon spoke again. "You planning to keep digging?" "I need to know what else is buried there," Mabel said. "Feels like I owe it to her." "To Lorraine," Vernon nodded slowly. "I understand that. But Mabel, if you find something, anything else, you call Sheriff Coburn immediately. This could be more than just old memories. Could be evidence in an unsolved case." "I will," she promised. Vernon stood, retrieved a key from his desk drawer, and opened a filing cabinet. He pulled out a folder, yellowed with age, and handed it to her. "Newspaper clippings. My father kept everything related to the case. You should read them. Understand what you might be getting into." Mabel accepted the folder with care. "Thank you, Vernon." "One more thing," he said as they walked back toward the front of the store. "There's a woman. Opal Reeves lives at the Pine Ridge Care Home now. She's 87, sharp as ever. She knew Lorraine, grew up with her family. If you want to understand who Lorraine was, Opal could tell you." That afternoon, Mabel sat at her kitchen table with Vernon's folder spread before her. The clippings told a sparse story. "Local woman missing," read the headline from June 1968. The article was brief, mentioning that Lorraine Pritchard, 24, had been reported missing by neighbors who hadn't seen her in several days. Her husband, James Pritchard, told investigators she'd left voluntarily, taking clothes and personal items. He seemed cooperative, but distant, the article noted. A follow-up piece from 3 weeks later reported that the search had yielded no results. James Pritchard had left Pine Ridge to seek work elsewhere, according to sources. The investigation remained open, but with no active leads. The final clipping, from 1969, was barely a paragraph. The property had been sold by the county for unpaid taxes, estate liquidation proceedings complete. No mention of Lorraine, as if she'd simply been erased from public record. Mabel studied the photograph again. This young woman who'd stood on her porch 60 years ago, smiling despite whatever troubles gathered around her. Pregnant, planning something, escape or elopement, hard to say, and then gone. She thought about the foundation stones beneath the fire pit. Had James built that fire pit after Lorraine disappeared? To mark something, to hide something, to burn away evidence? The questions multiplied with no clear answers in sight. As evening approached, Mabel called Trudy and explained what she'd found. Her friend listened without interrupting, then let out a long breath. "You've stumbled onto something painful," Trudy said. "Are you sure you want to pursue this?" I don't think I have a choice anymore, Mabel replied. She lived here on my land. Something happened to her. I can't just ignore that. Then you need help. Don't go digging around alone. And talk to Sheriff Coburn. Let him know what you found. Tomorrow, Mabel agreed. First, I want to visit Opal Reeves, hear what she remembers about Lorraine. Then I'll go to the sheriff. After they hung up, Mabel stood on her porch watching the sun set behind the western mountains. The land looked peaceful, beautiful in the golden light. But she couldn't unsee what she'd learned today. Somewhere beneath her feet, in the earth she'd tended for 30 years, lay secrets that demanded unearthing. She thought of Roy, wished he were here to help shoulder this burden. He'd have known what to do, how to approach it with both respect and determination. But Roy was gone, and this task had fallen to her alone. Well, not quite alone. Hank appeared from the orchard, grunting his way to her side. She reached down, scratched behind his ear. "You started this, old friend," she murmured. "Now we see it through." The next morning arrived with light rain, the kind that soaked into everything without seeming to fall hard. Mabel dressed carefully for her visit to the care home, choosing respectful clothes and bringing a basket of her honey as a gift. Old Mountain courtesy mattered, especially when asking someone to recall painful memories. Pine Ridge Care Home sat on the gentler slope of the valley, a modern building that tried to blend with its surroundings through wood siding and large windows. Mabel signed in at the desk, explained she was visiting Opal Reeves, and was directed to the sunroom on the second floor. She found Opal in a wheelchair near the windows, crocheting something complicated in cream-colored yarn. The old woman looked up as Mabel approached, eyes bright and assessing behind wire-rimmed glasses. "You're the Crowe woman," Opal said without preamble. "Live in the old Pritchard place?" "Yes, ma'am," Mabel said, setting the honey basket on the side table. "I'm hoping you might talk to me about Lorraine Pritchard. Vernon Kemp suggested you'd remember her." Opal's hands stopped moving. She studied Mabel for a long moment, then nodded toward the empty chair beside her. "Sit. Tell me why you're asking after all these years." Mabel explained about Hank's digging, the buried tin, the photograph and letter. She showed Opal copies she'd made of both items. The old woman held the photograph close, her expression softening with remembered affection. "Pretty girl," Opal said quietly. "Sweet-natured, maybe too trusting. Her people were good folks, worked a small farm down in the valley. She married James Pritchard in the spring of '65. Seemed happy enough at first." She paused, looked out at the rain. "But happiness doesn't always last. What changed?" Mabel asked gently. "James changed. Or maybe he just showed his true nature once he had her tied down. He had a temper, that man. People heard things, arguing, shouting. Lorraine came to church with bruises once or twice, though she said she'd fallen, clumsy-like." Opal's mouth tightened. "We all knew better. But in those days you didn't interfere between husband and wife. That was considered private business." Mabel felt anger rise in her chest, not at Opal but at the injustice of it. "She was pregnant when she disappeared. 7-8 months along," Opal confirmed, excited about the baby, making plans. "She showed me a blanket she'd knitted, blue and white. Said she didn't care if it was a boy or girl, just wanted a healthy child." The old woman's voice wavered slightly. "Then one day she was gone. James said she'd run off, couldn't handle mountain life anymore. But Lorraine wouldn't have left her mama and daddy without a word. And she wouldn't have left while carrying that baby. Did the sheriff believe James? Vernon's daddy? No, he didn't. But believing and proving are different things. They searched everywhere, found nothing. James left town soon after, and that was that. Lorraine's parents never recovered from it. Her daddy died in 1970, heart attack. Her mama followed 6 months later. Broken hearts, both of them. Mabel showed Opal the letter. The old woman read it slowly, then handed it back. "That's not James's writing. I saw his hand a few times on orders at Vernon's store. This is someone else. Finer penmanship, more educated. So someone else was writing to Lorraine? A lover? Or a friend helping her escape?" Opal said. "Though I never heard tell of Lorraine having close friends outside the community. She kept to herself mostly, especially after marrying James." Opal met Mabel's eyes directly. "You found something else, didn't you? Not just the tin. Foundation stones," Mabel admitted. "Under the fire pit. Like a building used to be there." Opal nodded slowly, unsurprised. Root cellar. James had dug one out, built it up proper. Then it collapsed that summer, right around when Lorraine disappeared. Said the ground shifted, whole thing caved in. Nobody thought much about it at the time, but Vernon's daddy always wondered. Seemed convenient, that timing. The implications settled over Mabel like a weight. You think he buried her there, then collapsed the structure to hide it? I think something happened that James didn't want discovered, Opal said carefully. And I think if you keep digging, you'll find answers that have waited too long already. She reached out, patted Mabel's hand with her thin, papery fingers. The mountain keeps its secrets, child, but sometimes it gives them back. When it does, you honor them. You give the dead their voice. Mabel left the care home with more questions than answers, but with a clearer picture of who Lorraine had been. A young woman trapped in a dangerous marriage, planning an escape she never completed. Pregnant, hopeful, murdered. She was certain now it was murder, and buried somewhere on property that had become Mabel's home. She drove straight to the sheriff's office in Millbrook, requested to speak with Sheriff Marcus Coburn. He received her in his office, a tired-looking man in his mid-50s with a reputation for fairness and thoroughness. Mabel laid out everything. The tin, the documents, the foundation stones, the history Vernon and Opal had provided. Sheriff Coburn listened without interrupting, taking notes, examining the photographs she'd brought. This is potentially evidence in an unsolved missing persons case, he said when she finished. I need to see the site, document everything properly. And Mrs. Crowe, I need you to stop digging. If there's evidence there, if there are remains, we need professionals to handle the excavation. I understand, Mabel said. But Sheriff, I have a question. If we find her, if we prove James killed her, what happens? He's likely dead by now. Justice isn't always about punishment, Coburn replied. Sometimes it's about truth, about giving a victim her name back, her story, and about giving her family, even if they're gone, the dignity of knowing what happened. He stood, gathered his equipment. I'll come out this afternoon with a deputy. We'll secure the site, start a proper investigation. As Mabel drove back up the mountain, she thought about what Opal had said. The mountain gives back its secrets. She'd lived here 30 years without knowing the tragedy beneath her feet. Now, thanks to one persistent pig, the truth was surfacing. Whatever they found, however painful, it needed to be discovered. The rain had stopped by the time she reached home. Henk was waiting on the porch, as if he'd known she'd need his solid, comforting presence. She sat beside him, scratching his bristled back, looking out toward the fire pit, where Lorraine's story had begun to emerge from the earth. We're going to find her, Mabel promised the listening mountain. We're going to bring her home. Sheriff Coburn arrived that afternoon with Deputy Alan Torres, a young man with careful hands and a camera. They spent an hour documenting the site, photographing the fire pit from every angle, measuring the foundation stones Mabel had uncovered. The deputy took soil samples while the sheriff examined the area with practiced attention. Mabel watched from her porch, Trudy beside her. Her friend had come as soon as Mabel called, bringing coffee and quiet support. They didn't speak much, just observed the official transformation of Mabel's land into a potential crime scene. This changes everything, doesn't it? Trudy said finally. It already changed, Mabel replied. The moment Hank started digging, Sheriff Coburn approached them after 2 hours, removing his hat in old-fashioned courtesy. Mrs. Crowe, we're going to need to excavate more thoroughly. With your permission, I'd like to bring in ground-penetrating radar tomorrow. Scan the entire area. If there are remains beneath that fire pit, we need to know before we dig further. Of course, Mabel said. Whatever you need. This might take several days, he warned. There'll be people coming and going, equipment, possibly media attention if word gets out. Are you prepared for that? Mabel considered. Her quiet sanctuary would become the center of investigation, speculation, gossip. But Lorraine deserved this disruption, deserved to be found. I'm prepared, she said. That evening Vernon appeared at her door without calling first, unusual for him. He held his hat in his hands, looking older than his 68 years. My father, he said without preamble. Deputy Sheriff Hiram Kemp. He worked Lorraine's disappearance harder than any case in his career. It ate at him, Mabel. Every year, especially in June, he'd get quiet, withdrawn. My mother said he felt like he'd failed that girl. Mabel invited him in, poured coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, the buried tin between them like a witness. Dad searched your property for 3 days straight, Vernon continued. Brought dogs, volunteers, checked every building, every ditch. He interviewed James Pritchard 6 times, but the man never broke, never changed his story. Lorraine had packed a bag and left, simple as that. Vernon's hands trembled slightly around his coffee cup. Dad always suspected the root cellar. It collapsed right around the time Lorraine vanished. Too convenient. But when he tried to excavate it, James refused permission. Said it was dangerous, unstable. By the time Dad got a warrant, James had left town and the property was abandoned. So your father never got to search it properly? Never did. It haunted him until the day he died. Vernon looked at her directly. If they find her there, if my dad was right all along, it would mean something. Not just to me, but to his memory. He was a good man, a good officer. He deserved to close that case. Mabel reached across the table, squeezed his hand. Then we'll make sure he gets credit for it. Everything he discovered, everything he suspected, it'll be in the record. Vernon nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then he pulled himself together. There's something else. Dad kept notes, unofficial ones, in a journal. After he died, I found it in his things. He wrote down everything about the Pritchard case, observations, suspicions, leads that went nowhere. You should have it. Might help the investigation. Would you bring it tomorrow? Sheriff Coburn should see it. I'll bring it first thing. Vernon stood, settled his hat back on his head. Thank you, Mabel, for pursuing this. For giving Dad's work meaning. After he left, Trudy helped Mabel prepare for the coming days. They moved her beekeeping equipment away from the investigation area, cleared space for vehicles, organized the spare bedroom in case Mabel needed retreat from the activity. Through it all, Hank watched from his shelter, occasionally grunting as if commenting on the proceedings. He knew, Trudy said, watching the old pig. Animals sense things we can't. Death leaves a mark on the land. Mabel thought about that as she lay in bed that night, unable to sleep. Death marking the land. She'd lived here 3 decades without feeling it, without sensing anything wrong. But maybe she'd been too wrapped in her own grief, too focused on rebuilding after Roy's death to notice. Or maybe the land had been waiting for the right person, the right moment to release its burden. The next morning brought clear skies and a team of technicians with ground-penetrating radar. Mabel stayed out of the way, working her hives on the far side of the orchard while they scanned her property. The equipment looked like a lawnmower, pushed slowly across the ground in careful grids. Data appeared on a laptop screen, meaningless to Mabel, but apparently significant to the operators. By noon, they had results. Sheriff Coburn called Mabel over, showed her the images on the screen. The anomalies appeared as bright spots against darker background, showing disturbances in the soil layers. Here, he pointed to one clear signature. Approximately 6 feet down, directly beneath where the fire pit stones sit. Significant disturbance consistent with deliberate excavation and refilling. Could be the original root cellar, or could be something else. Something else, meaning a grave, Mabel said quietly. Possibly. He pointed to another area, about 15 feet away. This is interesting, too. Another disturbance, smaller, shallower. We'll need to investigate both. How long before you know? We'll start excavation tomorrow morning. Forensic team from the state will be here. If we find remains, they'll need to be examined, identified through dental records or DNA if possible. Could take weeks for final confirmation, but we should know fairly quickly if we've found Lorraine Pritchard. Vernon arrived as promised with his father's journal, a worn leather notebook filled with cramped handwriting. Sheriff Coburn accepted it gratefully, promised to return it once photocopied. He sat in his patrol car reading it immediately, occasionally making notes of his own. Mabel returned to her cabin, suddenly exhausted. The weight of what was unfolding pressed down on her. She'd wanted answers, had pursued them deliberately, but now facing the reality of what those answers might be, felt overwhelming. Somewhere beneath her land, a young woman's body had lain undiscovered for nearly 60 years. Her child with her, never born, never given a chance at life. The horror of it, the waste, the injustice, it seemed too large to comprehend. Trudy found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. Her friend didn't say anything, just made fresh coffee and sat down beside her. They stayed that way for a long time, the silence comfortable and necessary. Finally, Mabel spoke. I keep thinking about her last moments. Was she afraid? Did she know what was coming? Did she think about her baby, about her parents, about all the things she'd never get to do? Probably all of that, Trudy said gently. But also she was brave. She hid that evidence knowing it might be found someday, that it might bring justice even if she didn't survive to see it. That takes extraordinary courage. I want to do right by her, Mabel said. Not just find her, but honor her properly. Make sure her story is told the way it should be. You will, Trudy assured her. You already are. That evening, as the sun lowered behind the mountains, Mabel walked out to the fire pit one more time. Tomorrow the excavation would begin in earnest. Tomorrow they might find Lorraine. The ground looked peaceful in the fading light, moss-covered and ancient, giving no hint of the tragedy it concealed. She knelt there, placed her hand flat against the earth. "We're coming for you," she whispered. "Hold on just a little longer. We're going to bring you home." The forensic team arrived at dawn, a group of professionals who treated the site with solemn respect. They erected a canopy over the excavation area, protection against weather and curious eyes. Mabel, Trudy, Vernon, and Sheriff Coburn gathered nearby, witnesses to what the earth was about to reveal. The digging proceeded with agonizing slowness, each layer of soil carefully removed and sifted. Hours passed. Mabel brought coffee and sandwiches, trying to be helpful, needing something to occupy her hands. Pastor Lee Brenner arrived mid-morning, having heard through the community network what was happening. She stood beside Mabel, not speaking, just present. At 11:30, one of the technicians called out. Everyone moved closer as the team worked around something in the soil. Not bones yet, but fabric, deteriorated, stained but recognizably fabric. And beside it, something metallic. The lead forensic examiner, Dr. Sarah Chen, carefully extracted a metal box, smaller than the tin Hank had found, sealed with rust. She photographed it in place before removal, documenting everything. With gloved hands, she worked at the seal until it gave way. Inside was a bundle of papers, wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly protected them from moisture. Dr. Chen carefully unfolded the cloth to reveal pages torn from a notebook. Handwritten in the same script as the letter from the tin, Sheriff Coburn leaned in, reading over her shoulder. His expression shifted from curiosity to shock. "These are journal entries," he said quietly, "dated from January through May 1968. Dr. Chen photographed each page before the sheriff carefully lifted them, reading select passages aloud to the assembled group. Mabel listened, her heart breaking with each revelation. January. James has been different lately. The anger comes so quickly now. I try to please him, but nothing I do is right. I'm frightened, but I have nowhere to go. Mama and Daddy are too old, too frail. I can't burden them with this. March. I'm frightened for the baby. He doesn't want it, says we can't afford another mouth to feed. But I see the way he looks at me now, like I've trapped him. Maybe I have. Maybe this was a mistake. April. I found money hidden in the barn this morning, more than we should have. Hundreds of dollars in a metal box. When I asked James about it, he grabbed my arm so hard it left marks. Told me to mind my own business, to stay out of the barn. What is he involved in? Mayla, I'm going to leave. I have to. For the baby's sake, I have to get away from here. Mama said I could come home, that they'd help me. I just need to wait for the right time. Need to be smart about it. I've started packing a bag, hiding it in the root cellar where James never goes. The final entry, dated June 3rd, 1968. Tomorrow. I'll go tomorrow while James is in town selling honey. I've packed everything I need. Money I've been saving. Clothes for me and the baby. I'll walk down to the road, catch a ride to Mama's. By the time James realizes I'm gone, I'll be safe. I have to believe that. I have to believe I can escape. Silence followed the reading. Mabel saw tears on Trudy's face, on Vernon's. Even Sheriff Coburn's eyes were damp. These weren't just words on a page. They were a young woman's terror, her hope, her final attempt at survival. She was planning to leave the next day. Pastor Lee said softly. She was so close. But she never made it, Vernon added, his voice rough. James found out, or she tried to leave, and he stopped her. Dr. Chen continued excavating around the metal box, working with infinite care. An hour later, she uncovered what appeared to be a small suitcase, leather rotted, but still intact. She opened it carefully, revealing women's clothing from the 1960s. A few toiletries and wrapped in a blanket. Baby items, a tiny knitted outfit, diapers. A rattle, Lorraine's escape bag. Everything she'd needed for her new life, packed and hidden and never used. Mabel had to turn away, overwhelmed. Trudy followed her, put an arm around her shoulders. They stood together looking out at the mountains, at the peaceful landscape that had hidden such horror. She tried so hard, Mabel whispered. She was brave and smart, and she tried. And we're giving her justice, Trudy replied. Finally, after all these years, by mid-afternoon, the excavation reached deeper levels. Dr. Chen called Sheriff Coburn over, spoke in low tones. He nodded, turned to address the waiting group. We're getting close, he said. The next layer will likely reveal remains if they're here. I need to ask those of you who aren't official personnel to step back. Give the team space to work. He looked at Mabel specifically. Mrs. Crowe, this is still your property. You have every right to be present. But what we find might be disturbing. I'm staying, Mabel said firmly. Lorraine deserves witnesses, deserves people who care about what happened to her. Vernon and Pastor Lee also chose to remain. Trudy squeezed Mabel's hand once more, then moved to the cabin porch to wait. The sun was lowering toward the western ridge when Dr. Chen's brush uncovered the first bone. She worked with reverence, exposing what was clearly a human skull. The team moved faster now, systematic and professional, revealing more of the skeleton. After another hour, the full extent of the remains became clear. Adult female, Dr. Chen announced. Young, based on bone development. Signs of trauma to the skull, blunt force, consistent with a blow to the back of the head. She paused, her face somber. And here, beside the main skeleton, fetal remains. Third trimester based on size. The words hit like a physical blow. Not just Lorraine, but her unborn child. Both killed, both buried in this unmarked grave beneath what would become a fire pit. The cruelty of it, the calculated disposal, left everyone momentarily silent. Then Dr. Chen made one more discovery. On the left hand of the skeleton, still encircling a finger bone, was a gold wedding ring. She photographed it carefully before removing it. The band was tarnished but intact, and inside, an inscription was visible. Sheriff Coburn read it aloud with a voice thick with emotion. J.P. to L.S., April 1965. James Pritchard to Lorraine Sullivan, their wedding date. Confirmation of identity, confirmation of tragedy. Pastor Lee began to pray quietly, words of comfort and rest. Vernon wept openly, not bothering to hide his tears. Mabel stood frozen, staring at the grave that had been hidden beneath her feet for 3 decades, thinking about all the times she'd stood there, all the fires Roy had built in that pit, never knowing what lay beneath. We found you, she whispered to the bones being carefully documented and prepared for removal. We finally found you, Lorraine. You can rest now. As the forensic team prepared to transport Lorraine's remains to the state laboratory, Dr. Chen made one final check of the suitcase that had held Lorraine's escape supplies. She examined the lining carefully. Professional thoroughness that paid off when her fingers detected something unusual in the bottom seam. There's something sewn into the lining, she announced, reaching for a small tool. Everyone who had started to disperse turned back, watching as she carefully opened the hidden pocket. Inside was another letter, folded small and sealed in wax paper that had kept it remarkably well preserved. Dr. Chen photographed it before carefully unfolding the pages. The date at the top read June 4th, 1968, the day after Lorraine's final journal entry, the day she was supposed to escape. Sheriff Coburn took the letter with gloved hands, his expression growing increasingly grave as he read. Finally, he looked up at the assembled group. This changes everything, he said quietly. This isn't just about domestic violence. This is much bigger. He read aloud, his voice steady despite the explosive content. To my precious baby, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and someone has found what I've hidden. I pray it's someone good, someone who will use it to stop the evil I've discovered. I thought James was just a difficult husband, that his anger and his secrets were just flaws I had to endure. But 3 days ago, I overheard him talking with men in our barn. They spoke of shipments, of money, of places across the state where they move their products. I didn't understand at first. Then I realized James isn't just making moonshine for himself. He's part of something larger, a network that spans counties, maybe states. The men who came were dangerous. I saw it in their eyes, heard it in their threats. They talked about people who'd crossed them, people who'd disappeared. When one of them saw me watching from the house, they all went silent. James came inside later and told me if I ever spoke of what I'd seen, if I ever told anyone, they would kill my parents. He said they knew where Mama and Daddy lived, that it would be easy to make it look like an accident. I was going to run. I had my bag packed, my plan made, but I can't run anymore. If I leave, James and his partners will hurt my family. If I stay silent, they'll keep hurting others. So I'm choosing a third path. I've been watching, listening, documenting everything. I know who the other men are now, 12 of them from across this region. I know when they meet, where they store their products, how much money they move. I've written it all down, recorded names and dates and places. Tomorrow I'm going to bury this evidence where only someone determined would find it, in the mountain laurel grove at the far edge of our property, where the ground is soft and the flowers grow thick. Then I'm going to send an anonymous letter to the sheriff's office, telling them where to look. By the time they find it, I'll have disappeared. James will think I ran away just like I planned, but I won't be running. I'll be hiding until the men are arrested, until it's safe for me and my baby. If you're reading this and I'm gone, it means my plan failed. It means they found out what I knew, what I'd done. Please, whoever you are, find the evidence I've buried. It's where only the mountain laurel grows, in the old tin that belonged to my grandmother. Inside are pages from James's ledger, the one he thought I didn't know about. Names, dates, locations, amounts. Everything needed to destroy their operation. Tell Mama and Daddy I loved them. Tell them I tried to be brave. And if my baby survived somehow, tell them their mother fought for what was right, forever. Lorraine May Pritchard. The letter's final words hung in the air like a weight. Mabel felt her understanding of everything shift. Lorraine hadn't been a simple victim of domestic violence. She'd been a witness to organized crime, a woman who chose courage over safety, who'd tried to expose criminals even at the cost of her own life. Mountain laurel, Vernon said, breaking the silence. There's only one place on this property where it grows thick like she describes. Mabel knew exactly where he meant. The far edge of her orchard, where the land began to slope upward toward the tree line. A natural grove of mountain laurel, 20 feet across, blooming pink and white every spring. She'd always loved that spot, had sat there often to think, to grieve Roy, to find peace. And beneath it all that time lay evidence of a crime network. Sheriff Coburn was already on his radio, calling for additional support. If this connects to what I think it does, he told the group, we're talking about a major criminal enterprise from the 1960s. There was a moonshine and smuggling operation that ran through this part of Appalachia back then. Violent, organized, connected to groups in Virginia and Tennessee. Several murders were suspected but never solved. The main leaders were arrested in 1969, but a lot of local associates were never identified, and Lorraine documented them, Pastor Lee said softly. She put the pieces together, and it cost her everything. We need to search that mountain laurel grove, Coburn said, looking at Mabel. Tonight, if possible. If that evidence is still there after 60 years, it could reopen cases, identify perpetrators, provide justice for other victims, Dr. Chen finished. Mrs. Crowe, do we have your permission? Of course, Mabel said without hesitation. Whatever Lorraine hid, whatever she died to preserve, needs to be found. As the forensic team packed up their equipment and prepared to move to the new location, Mabel walked back toward her cabin. She needed a moment to process what they'd learned. Trudy joined her, and they sat together on the porch steps. She was extraordinary, Trudy said. Trapped in an abusive marriage, pregnant, terrified, and she still chose to fight. To document evidence, to plan an operation that would bring down dangerous criminals, and they killed her for it, Mabel added. James or his partners discovered what she'd done, and they silenced her. But they didn't find the evidence, Trudy pointed out. She hid it too well, and now, 60 years later, it's going to come to light. Vernon approached, his face showing mix of shock and anger. "My uncle," he said, voice strained. "Uncle Dale Vernon. He died in 1969, supposedly a hunting accident. But if James was part of a criminal network, if there were local associates—" He couldn't finish the thought. "Your uncle might have been one of them." Mabel asked gently. Dad never talked about it, but there were whispers. Uncle Dale always had more money than his farm should have produced. He drank heavy, had a violent temper. When he died, some folks said it was convenient timing, right when that big operation was getting busted up in Virginia. Vernon looked toward the mountain laurel grove. "If his name is in that ledger, it'll answer questions my family has avoided for decades." As evening approached, Sheriff Coburn assembled a team for the search. Lights were set up around the mountain laurel grove, and the careful excavation began again. Mabel watched from a distance, Hank beside her. The old pig seemed calmer now, as if his work was complete, his purpose fulfilled. "You knew something was wrong," Mabel told him quietly. "You sensed death or injustice or maybe just disturbed ground. But you kept digging until someone paid attention. 2 hours into the search, a technician called out. They'd found something. A tin box, larger than the first, buried 3 feet down in the center of the mountain laurel grove. The tin was sealed with wax and wrapped in oilcloth exactly as Lorraine had described. Dr. Chen opened it with the same careful reverence she'd shown throughout the investigation. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, its pages protected by plastic sheeting that had somehow survived underground. The ledger was filled with entries in a masculine hand: dates, names, locations, dollar amounts, product quantities. Sheriff Coburn examined it with growing excitement, photographing each page before turning to the next. 12 names appeared repeatedly, marked as part of the local network. Beside 3 of the names was a notation, V, which likely meant violent or enforcer. Vernon leaned in to look, then turned away, his face pale. "Uncle Dale," he confirmed. "Right there, marked with a V." The ledger detailed operations from 1967 through early 1968, showing a sophisticated enterprise moving illegal alcohol and other contraband through mountain routes. Pickup and delivery locations were precisely mapped. Money flows were carefully recorded. It was everything law enforcement would have needed to dismantle the organization, if they'd had it 60 years ago. "This is extraordinary," Coburn said. "Historic, really. And it confirms what we suspected about Lorraine Pritchard. She didn't just stumble onto this information, she systematically documented it, understanding its value as evidence." "How many of these men are still alive?" Mabel asked. "I'll need to check," Coburn replied. "But even if most are dead, their living relatives deserve to know the truth. And any who survived should face whatever justice is still possible." He looked at Vernon with sympathy. "I'm sorry about your uncle." Vernon shook his head. "Don't be. If he was part of this, if he helped murder a pregnant woman to protect criminal profits," his voice broke, "then the truth matters more than family pride." The next morning brought a convergence of law enforcement that transformed Mabel's quiet property into command central for a multi-jurisdictional investigation. Sheriff Coburn arrived with 2 state investigators and a federal agent from the FBI field office in Richmond. The agent, Special Agent Pauline Cross, was a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and an air of competence that immediately put everyone at ease. She gathered the key witnesses, Mabel, Vernon, Trudy, and Pastor Lee, on the cabin porch, while her team secured both excavation sites with professional efficiency. "What Lorraine Pritchard documented," Cross explained, "directly connects to Operation Copper Still. a federal investigation into organized criminal activity across 5 states in the late 1960s. The main leadership was arrested and prosecuted in Virginia in 1969, but significant portions of the network were never identified. Local associates, distribution points, enforcers, all of that intelligence was lost when our primary informant was killed before he could testify. So this ledger fills in those gaps. Mabel asked. More than fills them. It provides the complete local picture. 12 names, most of which never appeared in federal files. Locations we never knew about. Financial records that could potentially be corroborated with other evidence. Cross paused, her expression grave. And it confirms what we suspected but couldn't prove, that several unexplained deaths in this region between 1967 and 1969 were likely connected to the organization's silencing witnesses or disposing of liabilities. Vernon's hands trembled as he held his coffee cup. My Uncle Dale died in November 1969. Hunting accident, they said. Cross consulted notes on her tablet. Dale Vernon, correct? Yes, his death is listed in our cold case files as potentially suspicious. The timing, right after the Virginia arrests, suggests the organization was eliminating local associates who might cooperate with authorities. So he might have been murdered by his own partners. Vernon asked. It's likely, Cross confirmed gently. These groups were ruthless about protecting themselves. Anyone who could implicate higher-level operators became expendable. The implications settled over the group. This wasn't just about Lorraine anymore. Her courage in documenting the network had revealed a web of crime, violence, and murder that had echoed through decades. Cross continued her briefing. We've cross-referenced the names in the ledger with current records. Of the 12 men listed, 9 are deceased. 3 are still living, all in their 80s now, residing in this region. We'll be executing arrest warrants for them today, charging them as accessories to murder in Lorraine Pritchard's death, as well as various racketeering and conspiracy charges. After 60 years, you can still prosecute? Pastor Lee asked. Murder has no statute of limitations, Cross replied, and the ledger, combined with Lorraine's journal entries and the physical evidence from her grave, gives us a solid case. These men participated in or facilitated her death to protect their criminal operation. They'll face justice, even at this late date. Mabel thought about those 3 men, now elderly, who had lived free lives while Lorraine lay buried beneath a fire pit. The injustice of it burned, but so did the satisfaction of knowing they would finally answer for their crimes. What about James Pritchard? She asked. He was the one who actually killed her, wasn't he? Almost certainly, Cross agreed. But James Pritchard died in 1991 in West Virginia. Heart attack, lived under his own name, was never charged with anything. He got away with murder in the conventional sense, though I'd argue he didn't get away with it in any meaningful way. Knowing what he did, living with that guilt, that's its own prison. Vernon looked up sharply. Did he have family? Descendants? Cross nodded. 2 adult children from a second marriage, both living in North Carolina. We've contacted them, informed them of the investigation. They're shocked, understandably. Apparently James never spoke about his first marriage or time in Pine Ridge. He reinvented himself after leaving here. The morning progressed with intense activity. The forensic team completed documentation of both sites, preparing final reports. Dr. Chen supervised the careful packaging of all evidence, the tins, the journals, the ledger, Lorraine's remains, and those of her unborn child. Everything would be transported to state facilities for further analysis. Though the basic facts were already clear, Sheriff Coburn shared information from his father's journal, which provided crucial historical context. Deputy Hiram Kemp had noted suspicious behaviors, inconsistencies in James Pritchard's story, the convenient timing of the root cellar collapse. He documented a mysterious fire at the Pritchard barn in July 1968, which had destroyed potential evidence. He'd interviewed neighbors who reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles at the property in June, around the time of Lorraine's disappearance. Your father was right about everything, Cross told Vernon, reading through the copied pages. His instincts were perfect. He just didn't have the evidence he needed, and James fled before a thorough investigation could be completed. Vernon's eyes filled with tears. He carried this failure his whole life. Thought he'd let Lorraine down, let her family down. He didn't fail, Cross said firmly. He did everything possible within the constraints of his time and resources. His documentation is actually helping us now, corroborating Lorraine's records. Deputy Kemp will be credited in our final report as a diligent officer whose work contributed directly to solving this case. By afternoon, news had spread through Pine Ridge and beyond. Local media arrived, parking along the road outside Mabel's property. She refused all interview requests, but Sheriff Coburn held a brief press conference, outlining the discovery of human remains connected to a 1968 missing persons case and noting that arrests were imminent in connection with the death. He didn't name Lorraine yet, wanting to notify distant relatives first, but he emphasized the courage of the victim who had documented evidence of criminal enterprise even while facing mortal danger. Watching the press conference from her porch, Mabel felt the weight of transformation. Her home, her sanctuary, had become the epicenter of a historical reckoning. The land that had held secrets for 6 decades was finally releasing them, forcing truth into light. Trudy stood beside her, as she had throughout this entire ordeal. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. "I think so," Mabel replied. "It's strange, knowing I've been living above a grave all these years. But also, it feels right that she was found, that her story is being told. She'd be grateful to you," Trudy said. "You could have stopped digging when you found the first tin. Could have reburied it, ignored the whole thing. But you didn't. You pursued the truth for a woman you never met." "Hank pursued it first," Mabel pointed out with a slight smile. "I just followed his lead." As if summoned, Hank appeared around the corner of the cabin, moving with his usual unhurried gait. He settled near Mabel's feet, and she reached down to scratch his bristled back. "Good pig," she murmured. "Very good pig." Evening brought the news everyone had been waiting for. Special Agent Cross returned to update them. All 3 living suspects had been arrested without incident. 2 in their homes, 1 at a care facility. All had been read their rights, all had declined to speak without attorneys present. "But here's the interesting part," Cross added. "One of them, Garrett Walsh, asked his son to contact us with an offer. He wants to cooperate, to provide information in exchange for consideration in sentencing. He's 84, has terminal cancer, and apparently wants to unburden his conscience before he dies. Will you accept his cooperation?" Vernon asked. "We'll listen to what he has to say," Cross replied. "If he provides credible information about other crimes, other victims, it could be valuable. At his age, with his health condition, he's unlikely to serve significant prison time anyway. But the truth he can provide might matter to families who never got answers." That night, after everyone had left and quiet returned to the mountain, Mabel sat on her porch, watching stars emerge. The air carried the scent of mountain laurel, pine, and fresh-turned earth. Her land felt different now, not haunted but cleansed, as if Lorraine's emergence from darkness had released some pressure that had built up over decades. She thought about the young woman who'd stood on this same porch 60 years ago, and pregnant and afraid, but planning her courageous act of documentation and exposure. Lorraine had been younger than Mabel's own daughter would have been, had she and Roy been blessed with children. Young enough to deserve a full life, a chance to raise her child, to grow old, to know peace. Instead, she'd gotten a shallow grave and 6 decades of silence. But now, finally, her voice was being heard. Her evidence was bringing justice. Her courage was being recognized. Mabel made a decision then, sitting in the darkness with only Hank for company. She would make sure Lorraine was properly honored, not just through the legal process, but through memory, through witness, through ensuring her story became part of the mountain's history in the right way. She called Pastor Lee, who answered despite the late hour. "I want to arrange a memorial service," Mabel said. "Once the remains are released, once Lorraine can be properly buried. Will you help me?" "Of course," Pastor Lee replied without hesitation. It would be an honor. She deserves to be laid to rest with dignity, with her community bearing witness. And her baby, Mabel added, her voice catching slightly. They should be buried together. Together, Pastor Lee agreed, as they should have lived. After hanging up, Mabel remained on the porch until the moon rose over the eastern ridge, casting silver light across her property. She could see the excavation sites, the disturbed earth, the places where secrets had been kept. Tomorrow would bring more investigation, more revelations, more pieces of the puzzle falling into place. But tonight, she simply sat with the weight of what had been discovered, honoring the courage of a woman she'd never met, but now felt connected to across the span of 6 decades. Lorraine had fought for justice, even knowing it might cost her everything. And it had. But her fight hadn't been in vain. The evidence she'd hidden had survived, had waited for the right moment, the right person, the right determined old pig to bring it back into the light. Mabel reached down, rested her hand on Hank's solid back. "We did good work," she told him quietly. "Lorraine would thank us, I think, for not giving up, for seeing it through." Hank grunted softly, a sound of contentment, and Mabel smiled. Tomorrow would bring the final pieces of the story, the last revelations, the complete picture of what had happened on this mountain in the summer of 1968. But for tonight, it was enough to sit in the peace of truth partially told, justice partially served, and a long, silent voice finally beginning to be heard. The forensic examination took 3 weeks, but when the final results came, they confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts. The remains were definitively identified as Lorraine May Pritchard through dental records obtained from her childhood dentist's archived files. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the skull, a single devastating blow to the back of her head. The medical examiner estimated she'd been 7 to 8 months pregnant at the time of death. The fetal remains, too small and fragile to yield detailed analysis, were confirmed to be consistent with 3rd trimester development. Mother and child had died together, been buried together, and would now be laid to rest together. Sheriff Coburn called a meeting at Mabel's cabin to share the complete findings. Present were Mabel, Trudy, Vernon, Pastor Lee, and Special Agent Cross. The mood was somber, but also marked by a sense of accomplishment, justice delayed but finally arriving. The confession from Garrett Walsh filled in the remaining gaps. Cross began, opening a file folder. He provided detailed testimony about the night of June 4th, 1968. According to Walsh, James Pritchard discovered that Lorraine had found his hidden ledger and copied information from it. He also found her packed suitcase in the root cellar. He realized she was planning to expose the operation. Cross paused, her expression grim. James called an emergency meeting that evening. 5 of the local associates came to the property, Walsh among them. They confronted Lorraine, demanded to know what she'd done with the information she'd copied. She refused to tell them, even when they threatened her. James struck her with a shovel handle. The blow killed her instantly. Mabel felt tears on her cheeks. Vernon looked away, his jaw tight. Pastor Lee reached for Mabel's hand, held it firmly. They buried her that night, Cross continued. Dug the grave where the root cellar entrance had been, covered it with the collapsed timber and stone from the cellar itself, then built the fire pit on top. Walsh said it was James's idea, that fires would mask any smell, any trace. They spent the next several days searching for the evidence Lorraine had copied, but they never found it. The mountain laurel grove was too large, the ground too wild. Eventually they gave up, figured she'd been bluffing or that the evidence was hidden somewhere they'd never locate, and they all just went on with their lives, Trudy said, anger sharp in her voice. Killed a pregnant woman and went home to their families. Most of them did, Cross confirmed. Though Walsh claims several of the associates were themselves eliminated by the organization's leadership when the Virginia operation was busted in 1969. The leaders didn't want loose ends. Dale Vernon was likely one of those eliminations, killed by his own partners to prevent him from cooperating with federal investigators. Vernon spoke for the first time. So my uncle participated in murdering Lorraine. then was murdered himself by the same organization. That's a kind of justice, I suppose. Cold comfort, but justice nonetheless. Walsh also confirmed something we suspected, Cross added. James Pritchard didn't act out of passionate rage. The murder was calculated, discussed, agreed upon by the group. Lorraine was killed because she represented an existential threat to their criminal enterprise. Her pregnancy, her youth, her innocence, none of that mattered to them. Only protecting their profits and their freedom. The weight of those words settled over the room. This hadn't been a crime of passion or a moment of uncontrolled violence. It had been execution, pure and simple. A young woman eliminated like a business problem. What will happen to the 3 surviving men? Mabel asked. All 3 have been formally charged with conspiracy to commit murder and accessory to murder, Cross replied. Walsh will likely receive a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation. Probably supervised release, given his age and health. The other 2 are fighting the charges, but with Walsh's testimony, the forensic evidence, and Lorraine's documentation, the prosecution is confident of conviction. They'll likely die in prison, which seems appropriate given what they took from Lorraine. Sheriff Coburn added his own update. The local prosecutor is also reviewing several other cold cases from that era. Deaths that were ruled accidental or natural, but that might have been connected to the criminal operation. Walsh has provided information about 2 other potential homicides. We may never be able to prove those cases, but at least the families will know the truth. And James Pritchard's children, Pastor Lee asked. How are they handling this? Cross's expression softened slightly. They're devastated, understandably. Their father never told them about his first marriage or what happened in Pine Ridge. They knew him as a quiet man, a good provider, someone who kept to himself. Learning he was a murderer has shattered their understanding of their own family history. But they've reached out through attorneys, asking if they can contribute to a memorial fund for Lorraine. They want to do something to acknowledge the harm their father caused. Mabel felt a flicker of compassion for those adult children, innocent of their father's crimes, but now forced to carry the weight of his legacy. That's kind of them, she said quietly. The day before the memorial service, Dr. Chen called with one final discovery that brought fresh tears and heartbreak. During the detailed forensic examination, she had found something preserved within the fetal remains, fragments of a small knitted blanket, blue and white, exactly as Opal had described Lorraine, showing her months before the murder. She was holding it, Dr. Chen explained gently over the phone. Or it was wrapped around her when she died. The positioning suggests she may have been trying to protect her baby when James struck her. The blanket stayed with the infant all these years. Mabel shared this information with the group gathered at her cabin. They sat in silence, each processing the unbearable image, a young mother's final instinct to shield her unborn child. Her gesture of love preserved in death. We'll bury them with the blanket, Pastor Lee said finally. It belongs with them. Vernon had been working with the county to arrange burial plots in the Pine Ridge Church Cemetery. Originally, he'd planned for a simple, shared plot, but when he mentioned the case to the cemetery board, they'd voted unanimously to provide a prominent location near the church entrance, at no cost. It would be marked with a proper headstone, funded by donations that had poured in once news of the case spread. The headstone was already complete. Simple granite carved with the words Lorraine May Pritchard and Baby Pritchard, 1944-1968, together always. At peace now, the memorial service was scheduled for Saturday morning. Pastor Lee had prepared remarks. Vernon planned to speak about his father's investigation and dedication. Special Agent Cross would attend to represent law enforcement's commitment to justice. And Mabel had been asked to speak as the person who'd ensured the truth came to light. She'd struggled with what to say, had written and discarded several versions. How did you honor someone you'd never met, whose story you'd uncovered by accident? Finally, she decided to simply read Lorraine's letter to her unborn child, the one that revealed her courage, her love, her determination to fight for what was right. The evening before the service, Mabel walked out to the mountain laurel grove where Lorraine's evidence had been hidden. The flowers were past their peak bloom, but still beautiful, pink and white petals scattered across the ground. She knelt there, placed her hand on the earth. "Tomorrow we'll lay you to rest properly," she said softly. "With honor, with witnesses, with the respect you deserved 60 years ago. Your story will be told, your courage will be remembered, and those who hurt you will answer for what they did." She stayed there as the sun set, thinking about courage and justice and the strange paths that led to truth. If Hank hadn't started digging, if she'd ignored his behavior or filled in the hole without investigating, Lorraine would still be buried beneath the fire pit, her story untold, her killers unpunished. The randomness of it felt almost providential. Back at the cabin, she found Trudy waiting, with dinner prepared and coffee brewing. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from shared experience and deep friendship. After the dishes were cleared, Trudy spoke. "You've changed through this," she observed. "When Roy died, you retreated into yourself, into solitude. But finding Lorraine, pursuing her story, it's brought you back into the world, connected you to community again." Mabel considered this. It was true. The isolation that had felt necessary after Roy's death now felt less absolute. Through this investigation, she deepened her friendship with Trudy, built genuine connection with Vernon and Pastor Lee, engaged with her community in meaningful ways. "Lorraine gave me a purpose," Mabel said. "Something beyond just getting through each day. She needed someone to find her, to care enough to uncover the truth. I'm grateful I could be that person. She chose well," Trudy replied with a slight smile. "You're stubborn enough to see difficult things through." That night, Mabel dreamed of Lorraine, not the skeletal remains or the tragic facts of her death, but the young woman in the photograph. In the dream, Lorraine stood in the orchard, pregnant and smiling, one hand on her belly. She looked at Mabel with gratitude and peace, mouthed the words, "Thank you," then faded like morning mist. Mabel woke with certainty that tomorrow's service would provide the closure everyone needed, the living and the dead. Lorraine and her child would be honored, remembered, properly mourned. The injustice of their deaths couldn't be undone, but it could be acknowledged. Their story could be told truthfully, completely. She rose early, dressed in her best clothes, and prepared for the day ahead. Hank was already waiting on the porch, as if he too understood the significance of what was about to happen. She gave him extra breakfast, scratched his favorite spot behind his ear. "This is because of you," she told him. "You started all of this. Lorraine owes you a debt," the pig grunted, unimpressed by sentiment but content with the extra food. Some heroes, Mabel reflected, came in unexpected forms, and sometimes justice arrived through the most unlikely paths. A widow's determination, a pig's instinct, and a young woman's courage that had waited 60 years to be recognized. Pine Ridge Church filled beyond capacity that Saturday morning. Every pew was packed, people stood along the walls, and more gathered outside where speakers had been set up so they could hear the service. The entire community came, along with state officials, media representatives keeping respectful distance, and strangers who'd followed the story and felt compelled to witness Lorraine's final farewell. The casket sat at the front of the church, modest but dignified, holding the remains of mother and child reunited in death as they'd been in life. On top lay a wreath of mountain laurel, the flowers that had stood sentinel over Lorraine's hidden evidence for 60 years. Pastor Lee opened the service with words about justice, memory, and the enduring human need to be remembered, to have our stories told truthfully. She spoke of Lorraine's courage, her determination to expose evil, even at tremendous personal risk. "We gather today not just to mourn," Pastor Lee said, her voice carrying through the crowded church, "but to witness, to say that Lorraine May Pritchard mattered, that her life had value, her courage had meaning, her death demands acknowledgement. We failed her 60 years ago when we couldn't protect her, couldn't find her, couldn't bring her justice. But we will not fail her today." Vernon spoke next, his voice steady despite obvious emotion. He talked about his father, Deputy Hiram Kemp, and the burden of unsolved cases that dedicated officers carry. He shared entries from his father's journal, observations, hunches, the persistent feeling that truth was buried somewhere just out of reach. "My father died not knowing he was right," Vernon said. "But he was right about everything. His instincts were perfect, his suspicions justified. Today we honor not just Lorraine, but all those who seek truth on behalf of victims who can no longer speak for themselves." Special Agent Cross provided context about the criminal network Lorraine had documented, explaining how her evidence had filled gaps in a 60-year-old investigation and enabled justice for multiple families. She announced that the ledger and journals would be preserved as historical documents, available to researchers studying organized crime in Appalachia during that era. Lorraine Pritchard was not just a victim, Cross stated. She was an investigator, a documenter, a woman who chose danger over complicity. Her work contributed directly to law enforcement's understanding of criminal enterprises in this region. She deserves recognition as someone who stood against injustice when doing so cost her everything. Then Mabel stepped forward. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the copy of Lorraine's letter, but her voice was clear as she read it aloud. The words written to an unborn child by a mother who knew she might not survive to raise them. The church fell absolutely silent as Mabel read. When she reached the final lines, "Tell them their mother fought for what was right," she had to pause, overwhelmed by emotion. The congregation waited patiently while she composed herself. Then she finished the letter and added her own words. "I never met Lorraine," Mabel said quietly. "But I've come to know her through her writings, through her choices, through the evidence of her character. She was extraordinary, brave beyond measure, and she deserved so much more than the life she got, the death she suffered. We can't give her back those lost years, but we can make sure she's remembered truthfully, honored properly, and that her courage inspires us to stand up for what's right, even when it's dangerous." After the service, the congregation processed to the cemetery, where two graveside plots waited, one for Lorraine and her baby, one for the memorial stone Mabel had commissioned. The memorial stone was placed at the edge of her property, where the mountain laurel grew, marking the spot where Lorraine's evidence had been hidden. It read, "Lorraine May Pritchard and Baby, 1944, 1968. Her courage echoes still." In the weeks that followed, life gradually returned to normal rhythms, though nothing was quite the same. Mabel's property was no longer just her quiet sanctuary. It had become a place of historical significance. Occasionally people would drive up asking if they could visit the memorial stone, pay their respects. Mabel always said yes, made them feel welcome, shared what she knew of Lorraine's story. Vernon stopped by weekly now, bringing historical documents he'd discovered or news about the ongoing prosecutions. The friendship that had deepened through shared investigation continued to grow. Trudy visited even more frequently, and Pastor Lee made a point of checking in regularly, bringing books or just sitting on the porch talking about everything and nothing. Special Agent Cross sent updates as the case progressed through the legal system. 2 of the 3 arrested men eventually pled guilty, accepting long prison sentences rather than face trial. Garrett Walsh died 6 months after providing his testimony, having unburdened his conscience, if not his guilt. The case had made national news, spawning documentaries and true crime podcasts that told Lorraine's story to audiences far beyond Pine Ridge. James Pritchard's adult children had established a scholarship fund in Lorraine's name, providing college support for young women pursuing careers in law enforcement or criminal justice. It was a small gesture toward enormous harm, but Mabel appreciated the acknowledgement. 3 months after the memorial service, a woman appeared at Mabel's door, unannounced. She was in her 60s, introduced herself as Ruth Coleman, Lorraine's second cousin, and explained she'd driven up from Tennessee as soon as she'd learned what had happened. "I never knew Lorraine well," Ruth said, accepting Mabel's invitation for coffee. "I was just a child when she disappeared, and my parents didn't talk about it much. But I always heard she was kind, that she loved children. My mother used to say it broke the whole family when Lorraine vanished. They spent the afternoon together," Ruth sharing fragments of family memory, while Mabel showed her the evidence photos. The letters, the documentation of Lorraine's courage. Before Ruth left, they walked together to the memorial stone, stood in silence among the mountain laurel. "Thank you," Ruth said simply, "for caring about someone you never knew, for giving our family answers we'd stopped hoping for." After Ruth drove away, Mabel sat on her porch with Hank, watching the sun lower toward the western ridge. The mountains looked peaceful in the golden light, ancient and enduring. Her home felt settled now, unburdened. The secret the land had held for 6 decades had been released. The truth had been told. And justice, delayed but real, had been served. She thought about the path that had brought her here, Roy's death, her grief-driven isolation, the choice to stay on this mountain alone. If Roy hadn't died, if she'd sold the property as she'd considered, if Hank hadn't wandered onto her land and started his determined digging, none of this would have happened. Lorraine would still be buried beneath the fire pit, her story untold. But all of those things had happened, had led to this moment, this outcome. Mabel no longer felt like a widow just surviving each day. She felt purposeful, connected, part of something larger than her own small life. "We did good, didn't we?" she said to Hank, scratching his favorite spot. "We brought her home." Hank grunted his agreement, settled more comfortably at her feet. The evening air carried the scent of pine and honeysuckle, the familiar mountain smell that meant home. Mabel's bees hummed in their hives, her orchard rustled in the gentle breeze. And somewhere among the mountain laurel, Lorraine's memorial stood as testament to courage, to truth, and to the power of persistence in the face of old darkness. The mountain had kept its secrets for 6 decades, but now it had given them back, and in doing so had transformed everyone involved. Lorraine May Pritchard could finally rest in peace, her story told, her courage recognized, her voice heard across the years. And Mabel Crowe had discovered that even in grief and solitude, purpose could find you, sometimes delivered by the most unexpected messenger. She looked out at her land, this place that had been home for 30 years, and felt deep gratitude for the life she'd built here with Roy, for the strength she'd found after his death, for the chance to serve justice for a woman she'd never met, for Hank's stubborn determination, for Trudy's loyal friendship, for Vernon's shared commitment to his father's legacy. The sun touched the mountain ridge, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Tomorrow would bring new routines, new small challenges, the quiet rhythms of mountain life. But Mabel knew she'd carry Lorraine's story with her always, a reminder that courage echoes across time, that truth matters even when it's painful, and that sometimes our most important work finds us when we least expect it. Home at last, she thought, for herself and for Lorraine both. The mountain held no more secrets. The land could rest, and 2 women, separated by 6 decades, but connected by determination and truth, had each found their peace in their own way, in their own time.